It's really exciting to be back with Chasing Lullabies. We were actually meant to have the Chasing Lullabies back in the Book of Devarim, but I think the summer holidays and the high holy days seem to have got in the way a little bit of that. However, we are now back with the Book of Exodus, and this is our fourth book of the Torah that we are giving the Chasing Lullabies treatment to, which is really exciting. And let us begin with what is the reason that we have Chasing Lullabies, just to remind ourselves that the lullaby that sort of begins many of these series is the lullaby that we like to sing to our kids. Rockabye baby on the treetop, when the wind blows, the cradle will rock, when the bough breaks, the cradle will fall, and down will come baby, baby and all. And it's this very famous, happy lullaby that we sing to our children. And yet, what does a lullaby really mean? What are the words saying? The words are dealing with something which is terrifying and horrendous, as the baby is seemingly placed in the boughs of a tree in the garden, only to be thrust from his rest or her resting place and thrown to the ground. And the reason that you've heard me say this spiel many times is the reason that we don't get alarmed by this nursery rhyme, by this lullaby, is that we said it so many times that we stop to think about it. And so Chasing Lullabies is our attempt to look at Torah text, to look at the weekly parsha in a different way, to try and uncover in a more deep sense what is going on. And we ask three types of questions. The first question is an internal question, something that's happening in the text itself. For example, a word form, a word choice, a grammatical positioning or abnormality. An internal question. An external question is the next type of question, something that arises from the text, something that the text sort of, something about the text that we're motivated to ask. And the final type of question that we're trying to include is a reflective question. How do I feel about this? Where do I position myself? Where do I feature alongside all this stuff? And tonight I want to jump into a type of text that is not always the explicit text, but rather is in the realm of Midrash, rather is in the realm of the stories and associated lore, L-O-R-E, that accompanies our texts. How do we understand them? How do we position them? And by looking at the Torah portion that we just read in Shul on Shabbat, Parashat Shemot, I want to take a particular midrash in Shemot in last week's parasha and unpack it. As often is the case, a lot of the material is inspired and taken from Rabbi David Foreman and his team at Aleph Beta. Any additions are my own and possibly the difficult parts. But just to recognize and to thank him and his team for all that he does to helping people access Torah content. And maybe something I can stimulate discussion with tonight is, how have any of you ever got confused between the explicit text, the explicit story on the one hand, and the midrash on the other hand? Have you ever kind of got confused between where one ends and the other begins, or what the purpose of the midrash is for, or ever been sort of just a bit baffled by what the midrash is trying to teach you or teach us? No. So I tell you, one of the times that I found this most interesting was discussing with Shoshana her education in her primary school, because in her primary school, so they used to teach, she said they used to teach midrash as if it was peshat, meaning they used to teach the stories associated with the Torah, with the Torah content, as if it was the Torah content itself. What do I mean? So let me give you an example. How many of you have heard of the different tests that Abraham, the 10 tests that Abraham experienced? Has anyone heard of 10 tests of Abraham? Yeah. Okay, great. So can anyone tell me some of them?
Sacrificing his son.
Sacrificing his son is the 10th and greatest of those tests. That's right.
Being in the furnace.
Being in the furnace, great. Being in the furnace. Anyone else?
Leave home.
Having to leave home. Good.
The famine.
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 That's right. That's right. And maybe sending Ishmael away. He didn't really want to send Ishmael away. I'm really gone.
Stopping idolatry.
Yeah, so maybe stopping the idolatry in his father's house and being a sort of a paragon of monotheism in the ancient world. I'm really happy that Russell, you chucked in also the furnace. I'm just wondering where did you find that? Did you read that somewhere in the Torah?
No.
You didn't read it somewhere in the Torah.
I told him when we were sat next to each other in shul.
That's good. That's good.
It's because of the song Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Okay, so the reason, Russell, you didn't find it in the Torah is because it's not in the Torah. It's not there. If you look for Abraham, the fiery furnace, sort of a relatively famous story about Abraham, you won't find it anywhere in the text, and that's because it's part of the Midrash. And this sort of leads us to the question, which is how we meant to understand Midrash. And I want to take a very particular Midrash in the Torah portion that we just read and sort of share it with you and see what you think. Is this a Midrash that we're meant to be taking literally? How are we meant to understand it? What's its purpose? So if I share with you Safaria, I'm hoping that you can see my screen. Is it a large Safaria screen that you can see, or is it a half screen that you can see?
Large.
Fine, good. So we're in Exodus, we're in chapter 2, I think. Okay, so this is talking about the conception of Moses and how his mother had to hide. She tried to keep him for 3 months. She saw he was an incredibly beautiful child, and then she wasn't able to hide him any longer, and she put him in the basket, and she placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Now, there is a person who has been intensely invested in Moses' life, and that's his sister. It's actually his sister that caused the opportunity. His sister that caused the opportunity for Moses to exist, because Moses' parents, Yocheved and Amram, they'd separated after the decree that Pharaoh made to kill all the baby boys. They said, well, we can't have any more children unless those children get put to death. And Miriam said, you're worse than Pharaoh, because Pharaoh only decreed against the boys and you're decreeing also against the girls. And so she convinces her parents to remarry, and that as a result of that remarriage, they have their third child, which is Moses. So the sister who is very much invested in this situation is Miriam. His sister stationed herself with this and to learn what would befall him. Okay, so here's the interesting pasuk with respect to Midrash. So the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile, and her maidens were walking, like her handmaidens who were looking after her, were walking by the banks of the river. And they saw the basket amongst the reeds. And she sent out her handmaiden, and she went into fetch it, to grasp this basket. Okay, she opened it up and she saw the child, and the boy was crying, and she had mercy on him. She took pity on him. And she said, this must be a Jewish baby. This must be a Hebrew child from the Hebrews. And so then Miriam gets involved. And Miriam sees that Pharaoh's daughter is keeping the child, and she goes, she says, should I get a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you? And then that's what happens, that she does, and she goes and actually gets Yocheved. She goes and gets Moses' mother to be the wet nurse. We're going to just pause there for a second before we get into Miriam's intervention. There is a very fascinating midrash on this verse about Paro, the daughter of Paro, sending out her slave girl, her amma, to get the baby. Rashi here quotes from the Gemara, quotes from the Midrash, and anyone who's done Daf Yomi today will actually know it was in today's Daf of all days, so it must be a very fated day. And so it says over here, et amata, it means her handmaid. Amma is a handmaid. However, amma can also mean something else. What else can amma mean? And amma can mean a handmaid, but amma, if you put a dot in the mem, could mean a forearm. So a cubit is called an amma. A cubit is a measure from the elbow to the hand, and that's a cubit measure. So our rabbis explained in the sense of hand that really, if that was the case, that it would have a dot in the mem. It should be a daggesh in the mem. But here it suggests that she's stretching forth. She's reaching out, not with her handmaid. It's not that she's sending her handmaid out to get baby Moses, but she's stretching out her arm. So somehow her arm is reaching far and far away to kind of grasp hold of baby Moses. And if any of you are fans of the Marvel series of heroes, so then you'll know that in the Fantastic Four, Mr. Fantastic has stretchy arms. Actually, well, you didn't see it first in the Fantastic Four, my friends. You saw it first in the Bible, as the daughter of Pharaoh, Bisya, sends out her stretchy arm to reach baby Moses in the bulrushes. And according to the Talmud that we read today in today's daf, so actually it was 60 amot, 60 cubits, which is approximately 30 meters, that her hand extended. Maybe there's going to be like a competition between the daughter of Pharaoh and Mr. Fantastic who can stretch the farthest. But she reaches 60 amot out into the bulrushes to reach this baby so that she can get to the cradle. Okay, so that's the Midrash. That's the Midrash, which tells us that the daughter of Pharaoh had very stretchy arms, and she used that superpower to access the baby Moses. Okay. Any questions that you have on that Midrash?
Why does it have to be so fantastical?
Explain the question a bit more.
In other words, this idea of stretching out to 30 meters, I mean, it's not something you would normally believe in. So why do they use it?
So maybe your first question is it true? Like, is it true? Is that your question?
Yes.
Right. So like we're moving into the realm of fantasy. The very fact that we're talking about Mr. Fantastic and Marvel comics means that we're moving into the realm of fantasy. So what is it meant to be taken literally? Are we meant to actually believe that this is what happened?
It's metaphorical.
Is it metaphorical?
It's saying that she's going to great lengths to get this baby because she really wants to get the baby, but it's, she's putting herself in danger. It's a raging river, blah blah blah. So it's emphasizing that.
Okay, and so one, Jeff's already sort of jumped into one level of interpretation of Midrash, is to say that Midrash is not meant to be taken literally. You're not meant to consider that there was this really fantastic moment, but it was meant to be taken metaphorically. There's some message that the Midrash is communicating. So if that's the case, maybe we need to just stand back for a second and sort of wonder that there are already two different meanings of this verse. One meaning of the verse is that she sent out her handmaid, that she sent a person on her behalf to go and collect baby Moses in a very natural, non-supernatural manner. And then there's another meaning of this verse, which is that she's got stretchy arms, and we have to sort of wonder: is one meaning meant to supplant the other meaning? What happened 3,000 years ago on the banks of the Nile? Was there a miracle of a stretchy arm, or was there a handmaiden sent out to go and get a baby? Is that what we're sort of reading? Are we reading a tension between the verses, between the explicit meaning, what we call the pshat, the simple meaning, and the drash, what might be a deeper meaning? Are we reading a tension there, or is there some sort of harmony between the two? And this sort of then maybe pulls us back even further to just wonder, what is the function of Midrash in general? How do we position it? All these stories that enrich the texts, are they there to offer alternative reads? Are they there to offer parallel reads on different levels? Sort of what is the purpose of Midrash?
Is there a sort of a metaphor here? Because she's saying, or it's saying, that she's moving her arm, her hand. And arms and hands at that time in Egypt were big deals. When you see some of the pharaohs, their hands are exaggerated in terms of size and usage. It's almost like not really, but almost like a crown to show authority. So she is therefore using an authority of not kingship, but superiority within, if you like, within the ranks.
So one second, you're interpreting here.
Also using his hand.
You're interpreting hand as some sort of authority. Is that the point?
Yeah, I mean, God is told when he does things, when he talks about his finger, he talks about his hand. His hand comes in many times to show.
Okay, so one way to think about you're already jumping onto what the metaphor might mean. So yeah. You're assuming that this is a metaphor, that there is something here that is meaningful, but on a metaphorical basis, and you're trying to seek an interpretation. No, that's great. But before we jump there, let's just notice the fact that we have these two different levels. And also just to notice that you're right on one level, that this word amma has two dimensions to it. Amma can mean slave girl, amma can mean cubit measure. And so there is something to be felt out in the ambiguity of that word. Russell, do you want me to...
I was just going to say, I mean, not necessarily agreeing with it, but presumably to some extent you can take it literally in extending her arm, because we've already experienced human beings in a different form to we would sort of normally associate. Yeah, if you go back into Genesis, there's all this talk of giants and what have you, which out of proportions of everything else. So you know, if that is to be taken literally, then there's no reason why you can't take this literally.
One second, well, tell me about giants for a second.
I don't know. You tell me. On the giants who lift up mountains and wasn't there was it one of them that sat on the front of the ark?
Right. Right. Yeah. Okay. Good. So one response to Midrash that Russell is saying is, maybe in truth there are two different ways to read this text, and they are two opposing ways. And it could be that there was this miraculous moment that happened. And that's what the Midrash is telling us, that you want to read it on a simple level, read it on a simple level. You want to read it on a more fantastical level. That is also entirely acceptable. There's certainly lots of fantasy that does happen in the Torah. You know, there were 10 plagues, there was the splitting of the sea. Why is stretchy arm any different? Rena?
Is it because it's very prosaic and very ordinary? She sent one of her handmaidens to get the baby. The fact that this Midrash says that her arm, it makes it much more important. It makes it much more significant. Not necessarily that it's necessary that her hand did actually grow, or her arm grew to however long it was, but that to make you think, to put it in that way, increases the significance of what she did.
Right. So then, by giving it sort of fantastical proportion, it becomes even more significant.
Yes.
Okay. Go on.
In the Torah itself, isn't it the handmaiden who finds the baby? So isn't it that Pharaoh's daughter goes down and the handmaidens just happen to be there, and they're walking there, they find the baby? Are you saying it was the arm of the? Are you saying it's the arm of the daughter that? No, she had a prophecy that it was going to be there. How did she?
One second, Stephen. So either it means that Batya, the daughter of Pharaoh, sent out one of her servants to get the handmaid to get the baby, or it means that the daughter of Pharaoh herself stretched out her own arm and it extended until it reached the baby.
How does she know the baby was there?
She saw a basket. She saw a. That's what the verse said, that she saw something in the.
I thought it was the handmaiden who found it. You saw it.
No, I think it says that she saw it in the.
She saw it, right? Okay.
That's right. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile, and she spied the basket among the reeds.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. So let me share with you another couple of midrashim, and I'm going to share with you then a way of learning midrash. Now, it's not universally accepted, but many of the early authorities and later authorities consider this an appropriate way to learn midrash. Amongst them, Maimonides, Nachmanides, the Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, and others. So it's a well-established method of learning midrash, and it's based. It's similar to what Jeff was suggesting about the role of midrash as a metaphorical tool. But hopefully we're going to deepen that approach a little bit further, and maybe to share with you with two different midrashim that will enhance our our understanding of this. The first one, this one's actually quite interesting because I think this one is possibly subject to dispute whether it's literal or not. But it was the first time that I heard of this idea of using Midrash in a metaphorical context, was that Moses and Pharaoh are compared in terms of their stature, in terms of their height. Moses is described in the Midrash as being 10 amot tall, approximately 5 meters tall. And Pharaoh is described as being approximately 10 tefachim tall, approximately 90 centimeters tall. So Moses is described as being a giant, and Pharaoh is described as being a midget in the Midrash. And we have to wonder, what is the purpose of teaching us this? Now, I'm going to share with you maybe, I don't know if it's troubling, but I'm going to share with you a Gemara that deals with this, but maybe takes it entirely literally. And I'm going to have to see whether that's going to be consistent with the approach that we're taking. But here's the Gemara in Bechoros, page 44a, and it talks in the Mishnah about things that disqualify a priest. And then one of the things about a priest that is going to disqualify them from their service is if their limbs are disproportionate in size. Now, this is not necessarily something which feels PC. I think the sense is that the person who is serving as a priest in the temple has to be of what is considered to be ordinarily perfect form, or wholesome form, rather than a form that is different to the standard. Now, that's not a judgment necessarily on someone who is of a different form. It's just the requirement of a priest. In any event, so those are the invalidations of a priest from serving in the temple. And then the Gemara asks as follows. Rav says, Moses, our teacher, was 10 amot tall. How do we know he was 10 amot tall? Because it says he spread the tent over the tabernacle, that he was able to spread out the sheet over the top of the tabernacle. So how can he do such a thing? Well, the height of the tabernacle was 10 amot tall. So if he was going to be able to spread the sheet over the top of the tabernacles, he had to be 10 amot tall in order for him to spread the sheet over it. So the question then is, well, how can you take that midrash literally? You're taking that midrash literally to say that it's actually true that Moses was about 5 meters tall, which means an absolute giant. I think the Guinness World Book of Records of the tallest person on current, is just about 2 meters tall. And when you look at someone like that, it's someone who's gigantic. 5, it's absolutely, it beggars belief. So it literally beggars belief. And so Rav Simi Barachia said, well, you can't be, like, physically that can't be true. Why? Because you've made him into a blemished priest. Because if his body, we just learned in the Mishnah that if a Kohen, someone who's trying to serve in the temple, is disproportionately large relative to his limbs, or disproportionately small, then he is blemished. And we know that Moses served in the tabernacle for the first 7 days before he gave over to Aaron and his sons the investiture of the priesthood. So Moses did the service for the first 7 days. And so now you're going to tell me that he's massively tall and massively big. Well, he's not. He's going to be a blemished priest. He won't be able to serve. Now, this conclusion over here was actually maybe one way to interpret it is that Rav says back to Shimi, when I said that Moses was 10 amot tall, I said so in reference to the amas of a board and used in the building of the tabernacle. You can interpret that in 2 ways. You can interpret that as the text here says, which means that he was proportional, that he was very tall, or you say that the cubits used in the tabernacle were a different size of cubit, and that nevertheless he was 10 amot tall relative to a smaller cubit, and therefore he was still of an ordinary human size. Now, the approach I'm going to take with you is that not like this interpretation in the English over here. That's an interpretation in the English over here. I'm not going to take that interpretation with you for today. What I'm going to say is that we have to actually change the size that we were talking about. When we were talking about Moses being 10 cubits tall, we weren't talking about your standard cubit of 50 centimeters. We're talking about smaller cubits used in the tabernacle. And actually, he was physically an ordinary height. Whereas this approach in this text, in the highlighted part of the English, will be the opposite approach, which will be saying that Midrash should be taken literally. And when we say that Moses was a physical giant, we meant he was a physical giant. If you're not going to take the approach to say that Moses is a physical giant, why would there be a text recording him as being 10 amot tall? If it's not talking about his physical height, what else might it be talking about?
his intellect, his importance, his stature, his righteousness.
His greatness, that's right. All those amazing things, that he was a giant among men. When we use the word giant among men, we don't mean that they're a basketball player in the NBA. When we talk about a giant, or among people, we talk about a giant, we're talking about someone who is a spiritual giant. We talk about, for example, Rabbi Sachs. Rabbi Sachs was actually a very short man, but a giant, an absolute giant, because of the stature that he held and the respect that he garnered from all quarters. So that's, I think, is a good example. I think here, the Midrash, it's telling us that Moses was a spiritual giant. He was the equivalent of 10 amot tall, and Pharaoh, 10 tefachim tall, 10 handbreadths tall, 90 centimeters, a spiritual midget, someone of lowly spiritual disposition, a very small person. That's the way that the Midrash is coming to engage with us. Another example before we jump back into our text of Shemot, here going into a different book of the Tanakh of the Bible, the book of Jonah. So over here it says, the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah remained in the fish's belly 3 days and 3 nights. Notice the form in Hebrew of the word for fish, Vaiman Hashem, dog. So God provided a fish, a dog. And the verse continues, also hadog, the fish. However, in the next verse, Vayispalel Yonah el Hashem, Moses prayed to God, Elohov, his Lord, Mime'ei hadoga, from the belly of the fish. What's the difference between the word for fish used in verse 1 and the word for fish used in verse 2?
One's female, one's male.
One's female, one's male. At first it says that Jonah was swallowed by a male fish, and then it says that Jonah prayed to God from the belly of a female fish. Why? So come along, our sages. I think Rashi brings it. Let me see if he does. If it's not here, then it'll be somewhere else. Let's just go to where it says Midrash. Let me see if I can find it. No. Okay, let me just quote it for you from here. 1 second. I've got it written down elsewhere. Might be able to find the text for you in a second. Apparently, I was in the wrong pasuk. Here we go. Here's the Rashi over here. Good. So the Rashi says, a huge fish, it was a male, and he stood there with room inside the belly of the fish, so that he did not think to pray. Then Hashem hinted to the fish, and it spewed him out into the mouth of a female fish, which is because of verse 2, which was full of embryos. It was pregnant, and it was crowded there, and he prayed there. As it is said, from the belly of the fish, hadaga, that he prayed from the belly of which fish? The female fish. Notice, by the way, if the belly of the fish was full of embryos, that would suggest the fish was a mammal, okay, which gives support to the fact that it's Jonah and the whale rather than Jonah and the big fish. Everyone says, don't call it Jonah and the whale, it's Jonah and the big fish. Actually, if it's full of embryos, it has to be a mammal, in which case it would suggest that it really was a whale. So you can strike back next time someone says, don't say Jonah and the whale. Anyway, what's going on? This Midrash has opened up a whole new dimension to this story of Jonah. We know that Jonah, he was the prophet on the run. He's running away from God. He doesn't want to give the prophecy to the city of Nineveh, lest they actually repent. And we know that the Ninevites are going to become the forebears of the civilization that will destroy the temple. And so he's a prophet on the run, and he runs away to sea to try and escape prophecy, to try and escape God. The storm comes, he gets thrown overboard, and as soon as he's thrown overboard, the storm subsides, and the sailors on board they repent, and then Jonah is swallowed by the big fish, aka now the male whale. Okay, that's all you knew. You knew that he was swallowed by a big fish. And then the Midrash comes along and says, not only was he swallowed by the big fish, but there was actually a sub-story to that. He was swallowed by one fish, but even there in the belly of the first fish, he had too much space. And so he didn't pray to God. Then he gets spewed out from that fish, eaten up by a female fish, because now we've gone from Doug to Daga. And there in the female fish, there's less space inside her belly. Because why? Because the belly is being constricted by the embryos, by the fetuses inside her. I do have a pregnant lady next to me whose tummy is being squished by a fetus at this moment in time. So, or rather bladder. Anyway, the point is that pressure inside the female fish is causing now that's the moment that Jonah prays. And actually, it's only in the second verse where the female fish is mentioned that Jonah actually prays. So again, what this is an interesting midrash. What's the purpose of this? What's going on over here? So I'm going to leave us on tenterhooks with that, and we're going to come back to the Jonah part at the end of Chasing Lullabies. But let's dive back into our incredible stretchy armed lady, the daughter of Pharaoh, sometimes known as Batya, sometimes known as Bisya or Bitya, Batya. By the way, why is she called Batya? So Batya, Bat and Ya, it means daughter of God. She's the daughter of God, so to speak, because of because she converted to Judaism. That's what also there's a midrash over here that she's coming down to the Nile to try and wash away her sins. She feels very uncomfortable about what's happening in Egypt, and maybe this starts to offer us new insight into what's going on to this woman. But without all those sort of other midrashim to sully the water, so to speak, let's just focus on what's happening to her. And one of the things that I think we need to do when we look at Torah text is to put ourselves in the feet of the protagonists over here. Put yourself in the shoes of the daughter of Pharaoh. We're suggesting, we're feeling out together that the daughter of Pharaoh is metaphorically reaching out over a great distance, that she's somehow stretching herself to something which is not yet within arm's reach. There's a common phrase within English, within arm's reach, or not within arm's reach. And that's the suggestion of something that can be held, can be contained within my capacity, as opposed to something which is beyond my capacity. Now, put ourselves in Pharaoh's daughter's shoes at this moment. You see a basket wash up on the shore, and you somehow realize that it must be a Hebrew baby inside. How do you feel at this moment in time, considering who you are and the position that you hold in this society?
Well, if her father found she was rescuing a Hebrew baby, he wouldn't be very happy with her, to put it mildly.
Right. And if we were to give a contemporary analog to Pharaoh, we'd say he is Hitler. He is committing a genocidal decree against the Jewish people. And so the daughter of Pharaoh becomes Hitler's daughter. Hitler's daughter has now come across a Jewish child. It's like Hitler's daughter has a Jewish accountant, and they wanted to smuggle their Jewish child out, and so they gave the child to the daughter of Hitler. What do you do now? Actually, there is a very famous contemporary psychologist called Stephen Hayes, who has created a therapy called ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. And he, in many of his presentations, in this sort of thick Southern accent, he says, whenever I speak, I always talk about my mama. So he brings his mama to the conversation. And excuse my very poor Southern North American accent. Just put a bottle of cotton wool in your mouth, Shoshana. Anyway, so he said, I always buy my mama because my mama, she had it tough. She was a Jew married to a Nazi. And he talks about how the tensions at home of a German man who had married in love to a Jewish woman, and then the rise of the Third Reich and all that meant, how that split their family apart. So you put yourself into Bisya's shoes, you put yourself into the daughter of Pharaoh's shoes, Hitler's daughter's shoes. How do you feel? Well, you feel absolutely torn. Because on the one hand, you are currently a participant in a genocidal decree from your father, because he feels, based on his sorcerers and predictions, that a boy born at this time is going to be the downfall of Egypt, is going to be actually the source of his death. So think about that. This genocidal decree was there to protect Pharaoh. So Hitler's daughter, or Pharaoh's daughter, knows that this is all to protect her father, who may die as a result of if the genocidal decree is not borne out.
Wasn't the whole point of the babies being thrown in the Nile, however, for the Nile to decide who lives and who dies? So is it not the case that she is recognizing that the Nile has kept this baby alive and therefore must have some importance, and so she should save it from that perspective?
That's interesting. I didn't know whether it was the Nile decides. I thought it was that the Nile is the great cover-up. It's the waters that wash away evidence of the horror that they are committing against other human beings. Either way, I think I suppose the point stands is that we're talking about power meeting, and now put yourself in baby Moses's. We're talking about power meeting something which is the opposite of power, which is victim. Power meets victim, or privileged meets underdog, or privilege meets victim. Because if you put yourself in baby Moses's shoes, so to speak, he is at the absolute bottom of the social pile, the child of slaves who has been condemned to death. So you have absolute power or absolute privilege meeting absolute victim at this point in time. So from both perspectives, there should be a clash. There should be no way for the two to meet. It should be entirely out of arm's reach, out of hand's reach, for the daughter of Pharaoh to ever welcome this child into her home. And the reason that we don't necessarily feel that tension and that pathos is because we read with the end in mind. So the first textual tool that we're trying to share in this exploration of the function of Midrash is to put ourselves in the shoes of the characters involved. Put yourselves in the shoes of the daughter of Pharaoh. Put yourself in the shoes of baby Moses. And in a moment, we'll also put ourselves in the shoes of Yocheved, Moses' mother, and Miriam, Moses' sister. But also don't read with the end in mind, because let's now put ourselves in the shoes of Miriam, standing on the banks of the river, watching as the child that she prophesied about, the child that caused her to bring her parents back together, and actually her father blessed her for bringing this beautiful child into this world, because as the verse said, there was this beautiful child Moses, and the Midrashim tell us that there was this light that shone from him, something very powerful about this child. But then when Yocheved can no longer keep him, and they're not able to maintain this baby, so her father curses her, and she watches on the banks of the sister stands on the banks of the Nile, watching, heart in her chest. And what's the worst? Who is the worst person that you could possibly have meeting this child? Who is the one person almost in the whole of Egypt who you don't want finding the baby? You don't want Hitler's daughter finding the baby Jewish boy. How did we know he's a Hebrew? Well, what else is the baby doing in the river? And of course, you probably have a Brit Milah as well. So how else? Who's the last person you want? The last person you want is the daughter of Pharaoh. So there is something, though, that happens according to the Midrash and according to the text itself, that Pharaoh's daughter, Vatachmol alav, she has pity upon the baby. It's almost like there's an instinctive human reaction that overcomes all of the rest. There's something deep and meaningful, motherly, in fact, that she cannot hold herself back. She reaches out across that divide because this baby needs someone to look after it. Even though there's all this rhetoric, all the horrendous things, she is the princess, for goodness sake. Maybe someone else should deal with it. It's just one baby. There are babies being slaughtered every day. She decides to take matters into her own hands. So when we look at the Midrash, Pharaoh's daughter decides to make a decision that goes against the grain, that takes something which is beyond her reach and somehow make it within her reach, somehow overcomes all that division between them. Now, if I had to put that into contemporary terms, I think one of the moments that is standing out for me is in the film The Pianist. Has anyone seen that? Has everyone seen that film The Pianist? Okay, so there's that wonderful moment where the protagonist, the pianist, is hiding in the German house, and he has found a jar of pickles, and he's absolutely emaciated. He's starving beyond belief, and he's trying to open these pickles, and he's hammering away at them, and the jar of pickles falls down and rolls across the floor, and it rolls next to a piano. And he hasn't touched a piano in years. He hasn't touched a piano since the ravages of the war began. And that night he goes to the piano and he starts to play. And he starts to play, and even with those crippled, frozen fingers, he starts to play the piano, and it's so intense and it's so passionate. The music in that film is amazing. And all of a sudden, the SS officer walks in. And it's that moment where you think that's it, the game's up. That's it, that's the end for him. And yet the SS officer, maybe because of the music, maybe because of the connection that they feel, the human connection that overcomes the difference between Jew and Nazi, overcomes all those separations. It's beyond arm's reach, but reaches out and helps him open up his pickles and shares his food and helps rehabilitate him. And so that might be one way to read the Midrash, that Pharaoh's daughter decides to go for it anyway. She stretches for that which is beyond her reach, and her arm extends farther than she could possibly have imagined. She's able to reach out over that divide and to rehabilitate and to welcome that child into her family. In this way, we're looking at the Midrash as one might look at the two different hands that play the piano, talking about the piano. Now, normally when one plays the piano, I only did a little bit of piano, but the right hand is the melody and the left hand is the harmony. So if you think about the Midrash, what the Midrash is that the pshat, the simple level meaning, the simple level of the meaning is the melody. And the Midrash, the next level, the drash, is the harmony. Play the melody without the harmony, it's a less complicated tune. All you know is that the daughter of Pharaoh sends out her maidservant to get the baby. That's the melody without the harmony. Play the harmony without the melody. Actually, that's a bit funny. Imagine you're playing a tune and all you have is the harmony, but you don't have the melody. Then you actually get a bit confused. And this, I would say, is possibly a criticism of when we teach Midrash in isolation, when we teach Midrash just as stories, what the Midrash says, what the little Midrash says, what the stories of the Torah are, without how they support, accompany, and deepen the meaning of the pshat, then we also lose something. All we have is harmony without melody. But when you play the two together, that you understand that physically what happened, she sent out her maidservant. That's actually, if you wanted to take a video camera of what happened on that day, she sent out her maidservant. Now, coming back to Russell's point very quickly, for sure, miracles can happen all the time in the Torah. But when the miracle happens in the Torah, we would normally expect that to not only be on the level of drash, but also on the level of pshat. So when the 10 plagues happen, when the splitting of the sea happens, that's an explicit miracle. It's in pshat. And so when it's in pshat, so then you have to say there's a miracle. When it's not in pshat, when there's a non-miraculous pshat, to leave it as a non-miraculous pshat and say the drash is coming to give a harmony to what would otherwise be a simple melody. The simple melody, she sends out her maidservant. The deeper meaning, this is superhuman. This is someone who has reached beyond her limits, reached beyond what is normally humanly possible in order to bridge the divide between Egyptian on the one hand and Hebrew on the other. So if that's the way to learn Midrash, if that's what we're learning over here about Moses and Pharaoh's daughter, before we come back to the finale of that story, let's just return for a second to Jonah. Why was Jonah transported, so to speak, from a male fish to a female fish, not only from a male fish to any old female fish, but a pregnant female fish or a pregnant whale?
Thank you.
I didn't call you a pregnant whale, darling. Anyway, So yet. Anyway, so this is going on YouTube. Anyway, there is something which is striking about Jonah. Jonah seems to be trying to escape his fate. He seems to be trying to escape God. He's running away and running away and running away. And what's the one thing that Jonah doesn't quite understand is that God can be merciful and compassionate. If you wanted to think about an attribute, a sort of a personality attribute that we most often associate with mercy and compassion, you would say that that might be a more feminine star attribute. That the attribute of sort of deep mercy and compassion, that's something we often associate with a woman. Why? It's interesting because in Hebrew the word for compassion is rachamim, and rachamim is related to the word rechem, which means womb. You see where I'm going with this now? Jonah is running, and even when he's thrown into the sea, and even when he's swallowed by a fish who is a male, there's still space for him to escape the hard truth that God is merciful. God has rachamim. And so God needs to orchestrate Jonah to be even more constricted so that there's no wiggle room. He has to face the truth. What truth does he have to face? He has to face the truth of an encroaching womb, of an encroaching rechem, to communicate something about God, that just as that God is merciful, God is rachum, as we say in the 13 attributes of mercy, the Yud Gimel Midos have rachamim, that God is a merciful God. And therefore, Jonah, you have to come face to face to the lack of space. You can no longer turn away from that message. The message is that you need to recognize that even on a nation that will ultimately destroy the Jewish people, if they right now repent, so then there is space for rachamim, there is space for rechem, there is space for compassion. And so that's and therefore you have to pray. And that's when the prayer occurs. And that's what the sages seem to be seeing in that transition from the male fish to the female fish, that it's there in the female fish where there is the capacity to be forced to face rachamim, that Jonah has his change of heart and faces up to the feminine aspects of God as well. Right. In this, finally, coming back to the daughter of Pharaoh, if this daughter of Pharaoh is truly going to hold tight to the values that she is espousing in reaching over a divide and welcoming this child in, there's a final piece that seems maybe to be even more in the subtext of the story. Two pieces, actually. Moses' name and Moses' ancestry. Let's look at those now as we come to the conclusion of today's Chasing Lullabies. The first part is Moses' name. Let me share screen with you and we'll dive back into our Exodus text one last time. Moses' name. Vayigdal hayeled, the child grew, vative'ehu levas paro, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. Who brought him? Pharaoh. Moses' mother brought him. That's right. Vahila leven, and she became Pharaoh's daughter's son. Vatikra shemo Moshe, and she called his name Moses. Vatomer ki min hamayim meshisihu, because I drew him out of the water. 1 second. Who drew him out of the water? Stephen, you're muted, but who drew him out of the water?
A maiden.
The maiden drew him out of the water. But she's saying, I drew him out of the water. Why is she saying I drew him out of the water? Because it was my command. It was my effort. It was my energy. It was my stretchy arm, but not physically stretchy arm, metaphorically stretchy arm. I'm the one that brought him out of the water. Now, 1 second. She brings him up as her son. What do you say, friends? Do you say that Moses knew that he was a Hebrew adopted by an Egyptian mother, or did she keep his heritage from him? How much was she willing to keep that divide present in the most powerful of ways to bring him up with a knowledge of his ancestry or not? What do you say? Did she bring him up Egyptian? Did she bring him up Hebrew?
Does it not, a bit later, does it not talk about him leaving the palace and seeing two of his, does it refer to brothers or kinsmen or something, which implies that he knew he was Hebrew?
Sometime after next verse, thank you, Russell. He went out to his brothers. And he sees their pain. And he sees an Egyptian man, smacking, beating a Hebrew man, from his brothers, one of his brothers. Okay, so clearly in verse 11, he knows that he is a Hebrew. Who told him he was a Hebrew? Well, let's work it out. There's two options.
Yocheved, no, she was nursing him, so maybe she.
So maybe Yocheved told him that he was a Jewish boy, a Hebrew boy. What's the problem with suggesting that?
He couldn't understand. He probably couldn't understand at the age that she brought him up, but at that age, you could certainly influence someone at a very early age to imbibe mitzvahs and all those other good things. So,
right. So there is there's an interesting Midrash that says that why was it that Miriam successfully offered the services of a Hebrew slave as the wet nurse? Were there no Egyptian wet nurses that the daughter of Pharaoh could use? And the answer is that, according to Midrash, Moses refused to suckle from the breast of a non-Jewish woman. And so that's when Miriam saw an opportunity and offered the services of Yocheved, his actual birth mother, to offer to be his wet nurse. However, if you are Yocheved, Moses' mother, and you are now put in a position where you have unfettered access to your son, what is the most dangerous thing you could possibly say to this boy?
You're a Jew.
That you're my son. You're a Jew. That's the most dangerous thing you could do, because that will jeopardize your ability to stay with him. Because if he says anything like that to his Egyptian parents, you're fearful that they will entirely get rid of you. And it's demonstrable, I think, from verse 9 that Pharaoh's daughter was not aware that Yocheved was his mother. Why? Because she pays the wages of Yocheved to nurse this boy. You don't pay a biological mother to nurse a biological child. You only pay someone who is simply a perfunctory servant serving the needs of another person. But if Yocheved knew, if Pharaoh's daughter knew that Yocheved was his mother, so you don't have to pay wages. You'd just be returning someone to their parent. So if Yocheved is unlikely to have told Moses that he was a Hebrew, who is the only other person that could have told him? If it's not his biological mother, it must be his adopted mother. Maybe they had a conversation something like this.
Wasn't there also, though, one of the Midrashim where Moses is put in front of Pharaoh and he picks up the coal, burns his mouth rather than the gem or something?
That's right.
The testing.
That is a Midrash. That is a Midrash, and so there his identity is hidden from Pharaoh, lest there be a danger and lest he be thrown into the Nile. So there's one person who could tell him to allow him to keep it a secret in a way that is safe for him. Who is that? It's his adopted mum. And maybe they had a conversation something like this: Moses, I love you and I always love you. I have to tell you, I'm not your biological mother. Your biological mother is one of those people out there who we have enslaved. And if you want to explore your heritage, then you're welcome to do so. But know that you've always got a home here with me. And then, verse 11, out he goes to explore his heritage, to see the pains of his brothers. It seems that the daughter of Pharaoh not only reaches out to this child and looks after him, despite the distance that is between them, but is also able to hold on to his original identity and nurture him to explore that identity as well. In today's world, we're often focused very much on difference and diversity. EDI, equality, difference, and inclusion, these are all important projects because of historical, systematic differences within society, whereby there have been the privileged few and the victimized many. it's very interesting, and it's, I think, instructive that in the Torah portion that we're analyzing together, we see an example of someone from outside the Jewish people who is willing to overcome the barriers of identity and label, and instead seek to find the common humanity underneath. What an amazing lesson that the harmony of the Midrash has helped to add to the pshat of the verses themselves. It's a lesson for us too, that in the work that we do, whenever we come across systematic bias, racism, discrimination, whether it's of an explicit or implicit nature, we should seek to emulate that example as it is taught to us from the daughter of Pharaoh, from the daughter of Hitler. If she could welcome the leader of the Jewish people as her son, so too all of us can find a common humanity with people that are different to us and welcome them and be open to them and to their struggle and to their needs as well. Thank you very much for joining me this evening on Chasing Lullabies. If there are any questions or comments, love to hear your thoughts.
So one question, why couldn't God have conversed with Moses and told him?
He wasn't a prophet at that time.
Well, we don't know.
Well, the first time he hears God's voice is at the burning bush. I mean, that's the remarkable nature of the burning bush, is that he's called to for the first time. That's where he has quite literally his calling. I don't think we have any evidence that he had conversations with God until that time.
Yeah, no evidence, but it doesn't deny it.
Okay, no, fine. I'm seeing a fantastical thread in Russell's interventions this evening. For me, I hear you. I think the burning bush one is, for me, it's startling because he's shocked to hear God. So maybe it sounds like he hasn't heard God before, but I hear it as a possibility. Okay. Any other thoughts? Fine. Well, I'm going to love you and leave you from the Cotswolds this week, next week in Barnet.
I really like the analogy with the piano and the midrash and the melody and the harmony. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, that's Rabbi Foreman, and when I first heard it, I thought that's such a good.
Yeah, it's a really lovely metaphor.
Yeah.
Have a lovely time. Sorry, told you what.
No.
Enjoy.
Enjoy the rest of your holiday.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Bye.